Hi, welcome to Neuroverse, a podcast hosted by Carolina
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond. Hi, welcome back to Neuroverse. The topic of today's episode is Laugh and the World Laughs with You. And we're joined by Professor Sophie Scott, who is a professor of cognitive neuroscience and director at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London. She's also the head of the speech communications group that investigates the cognitive neuroscience of voices, speech, and laughter. She first began researching speech perception during her PhD at UCL and subsequently worked in the Medical Research Council's Applied Psychology unit before returning to UCL to take up a series of Wellcome Trust fellowships. She now researches the neural basis of vocal communication, how our brains process information in speech and control the production of our voice, as well as the expression of emotion in voice, especially laughter. Sophie is an excellent science communicator, having featured on several BBC TV programs and giving several public lectures and participating in stand-up comedy herself. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast, Sophie. Welcome to Neuroverse.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to meet you both.
To get started, can you just explain a little bit about how you got interested in cognitive neuroscience and particularly laughter?
I got interested in cognitive neuroscience. Well, I didn't know it was cognitive neuroscience at the time, but around the late 90s, it was becoming more common for people to get involved in doing functional imaging studies. So using techniques like positron emission tomography and functional magnetic resonance imaging to take photographs of the brain in action. And I got involved in that and I found it very interesting, and I found it of kind of an intriguing domain to work in. It was nice to sort of think about things in neuroanatomical terms. And my background was in biology before I went into psychology. So I think I'd always been more of that kind of bent, if you like. And so I got interested in that, and I was doing more studies looking at how the brain processes speech and speech perception and speech production, because there was a lot of research into that field. And around that time, I was also doing work on emotions in the voice. And that was via a completely different route. That was doing neuropsychological studies with patients who had deficits in recognizing particular emotions. And all the work was done on the face, facial expressions of emotion. So I was kind of working with colleagues like Andy Calder and Andy Young up in Cambridge, trying to come up with sort of vocal equivalents of facial expressions of emotion, things like screams for fear and sounds for disgust. And then I just got interested in that kind of whole mode of, like, when you're in a more extreme emotional state, you normally don't talk about it. You might just make a noise. And there wasn't much work into these noises. So I started looking at these non-verbal expressions of emotion. And then I got interested in why they're always negative. So it's always stuff like fear and anger and disgust that we're studying. And I started reading more around it and found that Paul Ekman had said that there might be more sort of very well recognized emotions that were positive, that they might all share a smile if you had a photograph of somebody pulling that emotion, but they might be better distinguished like with the voice. And I thought, well, great, I work on voices. And that's when I started looking at emotions like a triumph and what I called amusement, which is laughter, and, pleasure and relief. And as soon as you start to study laughter, it just runs away from you. It's incredibly robustly recognized. It's extremely frequently produced. It's used with tremendous complexity. I called it amusement for many years, but we don't only laugh when we're amused. We mostly laugh at things that have nothing, quotes, funny about them whatsoever. And that's really what led me into laughter. It was not, I never set out to study laughter. It just kind of, as soon as I went anywhere near it, sort of jumped up going, oh, hello, I'm very interesting. Come and study me.
That's really interesting. And this may sound like a silly question, but from your experience of studying laughter, what is the purpose of laughter? Is it mainly social, to form social bonds, or like we still laugh by ourselves sometimes, not as often as when we're with other people, but what is sort of the main purpose of laughter?
So I think the main purpose of laughter really is social. It's probably at its heart, it's probably an expression of a kind of social joy. You're 30 times more likely to laugh if there's somebody else with you than if you're on your own. And you do laugh when you're on your own. It's just you're so much more likely to laugh when there's somebody else there. And the function of that is an expression of the sort of, joyful emotion, but it's also really important in making and maintaining social bonds. So we use it to strengthen existing relationships and to make new positive interactions with people. But we'll also use it in more complex ways. So laughter is strongly associated with play behavior. In fact, our laughter sounds a lot like what are called play grunts in other primates. And we do laugh to indicate that we're playing, as other primates do, other mammals. But we will also laugh communicatively. If you look at a conversation, people will laugh most of the time, not at jokes, but at comments and statements like, I might miss my bus, or I'll have another cup of tea. And Robert Provine, who did a huge amount of work on this, found that at any one point in time in a conversation, the person who laughs most is the person who's talking. So people are really using laughter in a communicative way to get people to show that they agree with them, or they remember the same event, or they understand something. And it's also used to manage emotional states. So people will use laughter to deal with stress, and people will use laughter to mask other emotions. So they might be frightened or embarrassed or in pain, and they'll use laughter to kind of cover that up. So it's a very, very complex emotional expression, which can be used in very often in just very basic ways, just like kind of you're laughing because you like the person that you're with. And other times you're laughing to sort of try and explain something to somebody and hope they understand why you did something. So it's really, really, it's like a hall of mirrors of possible interpretation, laughter.
Yeah, it's so cool. It's so interesting to hear you describe it. And it surprises me that it's the person that is doing the talking that ends up laughing the most, because I imagine it would have been the receiver trying to show that they are listening and agreeing. So alongside the fact that it's a very social aspect of our behavior, could you tell us a little bit about the brain areas that are involved? Could you tell us a bit more about the anatomy and the imaging that you do?
So I have to say at the top, it is very hard to look at people laughing in the brain scanner because people don't laugh to command and they move a lot when they laugh. There was a very interesting study from Germany a few years ago where they compared people laughing to command with laughing when they were tickled. They came and tickled their feet in the scanner, and they found a difference in the hypothalamus that was associated with the sort of evoked laughter. So the hypothalamus seems to be important, which makes sense. It's involved in kind of different sorts of neurotransmitters or hormones being released. There's also a clearly really important role for the anterior cingulate. The anterior cingulate in general is important in particularly in voluntary emotional expression. So if you are really scared and you scream, or something sets you off laughing and you can't stop, the anterior cingulate's almost certainly involved in that. There's also a very important role for the supplementary motor cortex sitting up here at the top of the head. Studies doing pre-surgical mapping for epilepsy, so stimulating brain regions to see sort of if you want to avoid removing undamaged brain regions when you do your surgery. The stimulating around supplementary motor cortex can result in people laughing without having any sense of mirth. So there's clearly some important role there. So that's in terms of producing laughter. There's a distributed and not entirely separate network that's also associated with hearing laughter. So when you hear laughter, you get activation in brain areas that care about voices in the temporal lobes on the left and on the right. You also get lots of activity in the supplementary motor area. And you also get lots of activity in motor areas, sensory motor areas in lateral parts of the brain. So that looks a lot like a kind of an orofacial mirror response. You're kind of maybe being primed to laugh when you hear the laughter. So I think that's still only a glimpse. We're starting to do more work where the laughter's got more context. So is the laughter something that's making something seem funnier? When you do that, then you start to see other networks recruited. So, it's that baby steps. We're seeing little glimpses of this, but it's going to be a very distributed network, I suspect.
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, I can imagine it must be hard to study laughter in the scanner as well, just because of the movement. Like you always want to restrict movement in the scanner. So if you're laughing, that's naturally physically challenging.
It is challenging. Not impossible, challenging.
Since you mentioned mirroring and potentially the mirror system, I was wondering about contagious laughter. And I read in one of your papers, a sentence that stood out to me was that contagious laughter is very likely to be unique to humans because humans can provoke laughter and respond to others' laughter in the absence of direct physical contact. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on this and how human-specific contagious laughter is in this sort of social context.
It's a very interesting question. So we know that contagious behaviors are pretty widespread in nature. So something like yawning, sometimes when you yawn, it's because you're tired. Often when you yawn, it's because somebody else has yawned and you've caught it contagiously. And that is something that you find that humans do. And you're much more likely to catch a yawn from someone you know than someone you don't know. So it's social. But that's also true of dogs. Dogs are more likely to catch a yawn from a dog they know than a dog they don't, or a human they know than a human they don't. And chimpanzees will catch a yawn from a chimpanzee they know. But even non-mammals like budgerigars and turtles, social animals where yawning exists, yawning is very frequently behaviorally contagious. And it always has this social element. So it seems to be, Robert Provine thought that it was affiliative. You're just kind of mirroring somebody's behavior back at them in a really basic way. And as I say, it's common. So quite a lot of the things that we do, like scratching can be contagious, blinking can be contagious, coughing can be contagious. And all of those things you find are contagious in some other animals. Orangutans scratch themselves when they're anxious, when they're stressed, and other orangutans will catch the behavior. They're kind of, oh yeah, I know what you mean, it's worrying. They kind of mirror it back. So you've got this phenomenon of behaviorally contagious phenomena being relatively common in nature, always having the social element, and that's associated with you finding it in animals that live in social groups. And the thing that seems to be distinctly different about humans, and we have a lot, as I say, blinking, coughing, scratching, yawning, these are contagious behaviors for humans. But humans also laugh contagiously. So when you hear a laugh, particularly if you know the person, you are quite likely to join in. So if you ask people, why did you laugh? They'll tell you something was funny, but actually it was just contagion. They're just mirroring the behavior back. And it is really interesting that people have gone in looking for this. So there's a fantastic researcher called Marina de Villaros, who's based down in Portsmouth University, and she does a lot of work on laughter in chimpanzees and gorillas. And she has really looked for their use of contagious laughter, and you do not find it. So they laugh when they're playing, they laugh when they're tickled, but you can have two chimpanzees playing and tussling around and laughing, and a third chimpanzee right next to them who does not laugh.
I think that's quite surprising because I guess we're so used to, as humans, laughing in response to others that it seems natural, so natural.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's probably quite important because all the other animals where play occurs, and as I say, these laughter vocalizations are really important to show that your intentions are playful. So play can be quite ambiguous. It's really important to be able to show that you are trying to be playful. But pretty much all the other animals, play is extremely physical. And that's why it can get out of hand. It could just be violence. So you need to, the laughter is helping you understand that this is playful. And maybe that's, the play vocalizations are sort of wrapped up in that the physicality of what's happening. We're sharing this moment and we're laughing together because we're playing. As soon as you haven't got that physical association, like the chimp who isn't involved in the game, then you're not laughing. The laughter doesn't jump the gap to you. Whereas with humans, it seems to be able to jump the gap. You can just catch a laugh from someone. It's something we learn to do, and that's true for contagious behaviors. You're not born doing them. They're things that babies learn to do and infants learn to do. But once you've learned it and it's very overlearned, then it really is extremely automatic. And in laughter, it seems to be possible for it to be something that you share without needing that physicality of play. And I think that might be one of the reasons why we use humor, because other people have also really looked for examples of humor in other animals, and you don't find it. And I wonder if one of the things that humor can be built on for humans is this basis of we're laughing contagiously. I can give you the intention to make you laugh and share a laugh with you without you necessarily having to have some bigger signifier of I'm playing a game with you, like I'm tickling you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's really cool the way that humans seem to have like jumped this gap, and that now not only we have it and we have the contagious laughter, but like you said, we use, for example, stand-up comedy in movies trying to continue to make us laugh. It leads me to wonder, what are the causes of laughter? If it can be contagious, if it can be like a purely social thing. But also, I heard that laughter is just the response to surprise. Is that true, or is it different?
I mean, it can be if that's something that sometimes surprises are frightening or
Yeah.
upsetting. But so it can be that you laugh. It is interesting if you look at the setup for like a classic joke, in that, and the comedian's telling a joke, the audience can tell that this is meant to be funny because we've got this person who is this comedian. They're a japester, and they say something that sounds like it's going to be a joke. The words that they're saying matter, but also the way that they're telling it. So there are many different theories about humor, which are always kind of specific to explaining why any one joke is funny. But what they always miss is that the audience are expecting something to be funny. They are also not expecting to be told something that they know.
Mm.
So something unexpected is off, not always, but can be at the heart of something that might make us laugh in a comedy situation. So I think it's the surprise can be involved as long as you also perceive that this is something that is not harmful to you. Or it could also be involved if that surprise is something that's stressing you out, but you're trying to show that you're okay. I was leaving the house really early the other morning and I frightened my downstairs neighbour because I was sort of holding the door open for him at 6:15 in the morning. It was all completely dark and he wasn't expecting me, and I really made him jump. And then we both laughed and we went on with our day. And I was like, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you. So he had been genuinely, what the hell's that? And then we laughed together because we'd known each other for a couple of decades, and we can sort of get over this slightly embarrassing moment where, at one level I'd done something to frighten him and he could have been legitimately cross with me. So we sort of the laughter there is, at one level, it's associated with the surprise, but it's also associated with oh, it's all right, sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you, we're all okay now. So it's very layered.
Do apes also laugh if you surprise them? Do they have a similar response to us?
No,
Okay.
the chimpanzees do laugh differently when you tickle them than if they're trying to make play last longer. And that's quite like the difference between us laughing helplessly at something uncontrollably or laughing in a conversation. But what you don't find in apes is something where the laughter seems to be associated with something humorous.
Mm.
Now, there's a couple of exceptions to this. The closest you find in other animals to something that looks like humor, or your element of surprise, is teasing. When like a juvenile monkey might go up and pull the tail of another monkey, and that you can sort of see that's the basis of a pretty basic kind of a joke, a childish, irritating joke. But you could imagine that sort of teasing thing is one end of a sort of spectrum of humor. So you can see the elements of that potentially in an evolutionary sense, having sort of not being unrelated to how we use humor. But it's interesting that the monkeys don't react to it with laughter. There's no laughter at all. The teaser and the teasee don't laugh. It's responded to with irritation, if anything.
Mm.
Animals that are highly social and have a lot of contact with humans do seem to do something that looks a bit more like humor. So I've seen a video of an elephant like stealing a woman's hat and then putting it back. The elephant doesn't, as far as we can hear, make a noise. So the elephant isn't laughing. But it's possible they're making a noise we can't hear. They are very complex animals. But it's significant that the elephants that do this are elephants that have experience with humans. And the same's true for like the signing gorilla Coco. She told a couple of jokes, and you could sort of say they might have been meant to be jokes. But interestingly, she did not laugh when she told them, or when she said the thing that was perceived as funny. And there's a third example of there's a zoo in the US where the chimpanzees learned to throw rocks at the humans who were at the zoo, and the humans would come closer, like the idiots we are, to see what's happening with the rocks. And when they got them close enough, the chimpanzees would then start hurling feces at them, and the humans would all run away, but they'd run away laughing. So I think in each of those situations, and it's possible there's something meant to be humorous there, but I think it's also they're engineering situations where the humans laugh, and that might be the thing that's interesting. Maybe humans are nicer when they've been laughing. Maybe it's just interesting to hear them make that noise. So, but the exceptions of anything that looks more like humor in other animals does seem to be still associated with humans. It's in situations where there's a human involved, an exposure and familiarity with humans. So I think it's possible out in the wild, it doesn't really exist.
That's really interesting because it actually reminds me of an episode we recorded with somebody else who'd done a PhD studying chimpanzee behavior. And I remember something that was raised was like the interaction between humans and animals, and whether or not animals can sort of pick up human behaviors and learn those human behaviors. So would it be possible if an animal spent enough time with a human for it to learn how to, exhibit like contagious laughter, like get the contagion of laughter from humans?
I mean, it'd be very interesting to know. Certainly, the cases I described, it's all where the animal has learned to do something to make the humans laugh.
Mm.
It's an empirical question. We just don't know. It's a very interesting question.
And the fact that they are trying to induce laughter in humans, I mean, maybe they're not trying, but it seems like they're trying to induce
Does seem
laughter,
like it, yeah.
suggests they must know that laughter is a good thing. Like they must know it is something meaningful to us.
It's possible. Maybe humans are just nicer when they've been laughing,
Mm.
We don't laugh randomly. We tend to laugh in certain situations where we feel sort of safer and more comfortable. So maybe that's just a different, humans aren't always like that, and maybe they're a bit more scary when they're not in that mode.
I also think it's interesting that you highlighted the human specificity of humor, because for me, when I think of humor for humans, it tends to be very verbal, like comedy shows. It's all about the words that are spoken. In fact, my friend was literally telling me this morning that he had just gone to a comedy show, but it was all in Italian, and so I wouldn't understand any of it, and I wouldn't understand the cultural context, so that's a shame. And of course, then it makes sense that animals might not exhibit humor. And when you said about teasing behavior, that made a lot of sense, because that is like one of the few non-verbal physical things that we can find funny, I guess. But I
Yeah.
also find it interesting within the human realm that there might be sociocultural differences in laughter. And I was reading a little bit about how countries that have more migration and like a richer history tend to have more laughter,
Mm.
and that it may be because of the necessity to rely more on nonverbal communication. Yeah.
It was just a really interesting study. So, I mean, as far as we can see, laughter is something you find in all human cultures, but there are differences in how it's used. And what they did was just exactly like you say, they sort of zoomed out and said, we look at the whole world and just say how much historic migration has occurred, how much sort of movement of different peoples through this place has gone on and is going on. And you find that smiling and laughter are both more frequent and more clearly expressed in parts of the world where there are higher levels of historic migration, like Western Europe or somewhere like Singapore. You get lots of different people moving through. And you have a positive social and emotional expression like laughter starts to become really important if you can't assume you speak the same language as everybody you meet. How to make an interaction with people go through more smoothly is going to be made more possible with smiling and laughter. And I thought what was very interesting, they repeated it in the US with different states in the US, which vary in their amounts of migration, and you get the same finding. So there is something, even within one, loosely termed culture, you can still get this effect. So it seems very sensitive to your exposure to other people and the context in which that's happening. But there are also simply cultural differences where like the functional use of laughter can be very different. So there are differences in how polite laughter is. Every culture has got situations where laughter is considered more or less polite. In Japan, it's not really considered polite to laugh in the workplace, but the same group of people who have been not laughing together at work because it would be rude, when they go out in the evening, will be laughing because now it's fine. In the UK, we're more comfortable with laughter in the workplace, but we get really upset if people laugh in court. It's always commented on negatively. If like a defendant or defendants are seen laughing inside the courtroom or outside the courtroom, it is always taken as they're not taking this seriously. They don't understand the harm they've caused. We read all this stuff into it. Whereas it's possible they're laughing because they're nervous. So you've got this kind of level where it's acceptable.
I guess that really proves how integrated laughter is in our social communication.
Yeah.
But in that study, did they only look at laughter? Did they also look at negative emotional reactions?
No, I think they looked at laughter and smiling.
Okay, because I'm wondering if it's like laughter specific, or maybe it's just like the reliance on nonverbal communication, if there would also just be a more robust general facial expressions and vocal communications in both positive and negative sides.
It's a good question, and I don't think they looked at that. I think they looked at laughter and smiling because they are very common in interactions,
Mhm.
much more common than overt markers of hostility. I mean, you get those, but they are less frequent, certainly less frequently managed. There was a really interesting study, and I don't know if she's written it up, but somebody who works with she was looking for theory of mind, markers of theory of mind in apes. And she was working with chimpanzees in the DRC in Africa, and she was also working with mothers and babies. And what she did in both the situations was she was introducing something unfamiliar to the environment, because what you're looking for, the markers of joint attention, shared attention. So if you introduce something strange to the environment, to the mum and baby, look at it, do they kind of communicate about it, like this thing that you and I have seen, what's that? Humans do this a lot. Like, by me looking at something and then looking at you, you kind of you don't even have to say anything, like, well, what's that thing? So they're trying to see if you could get that response in other apes. And it's really important aspect of how humans communicate with each other. Again, kind of like intentions jumping the gap. I don't have to say to you, or physically grab the thing and take it to you. We can both look at it and know that we're thinking about the same thing. So they introduced strange things to the environment for these two groups, the chimpanzees and their babies, and the mums and their babies. And for the mums and the babies, they're using like a laser pointer. It's like a little dot moving around. And the babies would start chasing this thing around, and the mums and the babies would both laugh. And, well, here, what's this strange thing? Well, let's have fun with it. And the chimpanzees would react, without exception, with concern. The laser pointer, for some reason, didn't work with the chimpanzees. So they were just introducing a large, shiny metal ball, which looks odd. And the chimpanzees just went up to it and looked at it like, what's that? And at one point, one of the chimpanzees just reached out and grabbed a juvenile and brought the juvenile in. And they both looked at this thing with real worry, like, what's this scary thing? And I thought, that's so interesting. Even without the shared attention, they weren't finding many signs of shared attention, but they were seeing a reaction to the strange thing. But the emotional response was so interesting. The babies and humans were laughing and being curious, and the chimpanzees were curious but worried. And the whole thing was like, oh, this is very anxiety provoking. Oh no, what's this new thing? And I asked her about it because, her focus was on the joint attention, not on the emotions. And she said, oh, well, if you're a chimpanzee, you spend most of your day managing conflict. Aggression and aggressive behavior is the norm, particularly, unfortunately, if you happen to be a female. This is the behavior toward you isn't always very nice. So there's no sort of smoothing things over with laughter as the humans were doing. Or this is fun. The humans kind of they're not having to spend all their time worrying about aggression and conflict. So there's a sort of maybe a normal footing for humans where the humans are comfortable is in that sort of playful curiosity mode. And if you can get interactions onto that basis, that seems to be, I mean, not all human conversations are completely riddled with laughter, but that's a place where maybe humans are in a default way quite comfortable, and means we don't have to be getting things onto okay, I don't know who you are, so let's be aggressive to each other basis, which is of course what the chimps do.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a super important point. I think it's really highlighted for me, like just reflecting on the luxury that we have being humans.
Yes.
Because yeah, we're not always in like flight or fight mode.
Yeah, yeah.
We have the luxury to experience these like richer emotions, like joy, I guess, laughter. Yeah.
Curiosity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. And the initial point that you made about how cultural laughter can be, I kind of assumed that laughter would have a more social root and not be as cultural, given that laughter is also seen in other animals. And also in terms of what you were saying about the chimpanzees and how they're always in this state of fight or flight. But don't you also see a lot of laughter when dealing with things like trauma? And, you hear like refugee stories, and they often deal with, the events that happen to them through laughter.
Mm.
So how would you fit in that aspect of how we deal with laughter?
So, I mean, I think for human laughter, it's always both. It is like a prepotent response. Babies will laugh even if they've never heard or seen laughter. If they're deaf and blind, they still will produce laughter. It's a prepotent response, if you like, but it's something you can clearly encourage in development, and which is under tremendous patterns of sort of cultural control, so it'll be shaped by the culture you're in. But I think your point is a really interesting one. I gave a talk once and somebody came up afterwards. They were a therapist and they worked with people who'd been victims of torture. And he said, you would not believe how much people laugh when they're talking about it. And I think that's partly because laughter is an effective way of dealing with stress. And if you particularly you can get other people joining in, then you can sort of feel better about something that might have been stressful. But I think also it can kind of give you some ownership over something, like turning it into something that you can laugh at. You get the story back. It's your story to tell, and you can distance yourself almost from the pain is still there, but you can distance yourself from it with the ownership and the laughter. I think there's a sort of an element of this. It's not that it's not going to remain painful and terrible and awful that it happened to you. Not that you're unscarred by it, but the laughter is a way of controlling and managing that and giving you just a different way of approaching it.
That's so incredible. What you said about the ownership makes so much sense. I had another follow-up question. So I can understand how laughter isn't contagious with other apes and other animals, but what about smiling? Because that's something that happens across humans and animals, I think, and it's a very social thing. Does smiling in animals match more closely to how humans smile, or is it like laughter in that it's quite different still?
But it's interesting because the smiling that you get in other animals matches what we call play face. So what animals do to indicate that they're playing is they make a sound, a distinctive sound, play vocalizations, which are often actually what turn out to be laughter. But also you get this loose, open, sort of unthreatening mouth. There's no tension in the mouth. There's no teeth bared, things like that. And that is different from our kind of smile. And actually, it's difficult because in our closest relatives, teeth baring is generally aggressive. Like just doing that is not a positive sign. But De Villa Ross, if I remember correctly, she reckons she's found something that looks a lot more like our social smiling in other apes. Certainly, I think it was in chimpanzees. So something that looks more like kind of like the smiling on an emoji face. So it's possible that that's not something that you only find in humans, but the play face you definitely find that in all mammals. Dolphins do it, dogs do it. It's everywhere.
Also, something that's been constantly mentioned throughout is the fact that there are different types of laughter, like whether or not it's voluntary, or if you're trying to lighten the mood, or if you're just really finding it funny and it's just completely reflexive. So in terms of neuroscience and neural processing, how different are these different types and forms of laughter?
So I think very crudely, there are two different kinds of laughter vocalizations. One is involuntary, spontaneous vocalization, almost certainly associated with this kind of anterior cingulate system that's associated with involuntary, reactive emotional vocalizations. That's basically exactly the same mechanism in all mammals. That's the vocalization control in dogs and otters, and it's not it's midline. It goes from the anterior cingulate down to the brainstem, and it's not through the periaqueductal gray, and it's emotional, it's reactive, it's largely involuntary. Humans have also got this other motor system, these lateral motor areas, which are involved when you do something voluntary with your voice, like me talking right now. And I think that is frequently what's recruited when you laugh in a more communicative way. And certainly if you look at how people laugh when they're in conversations, they don't just start screaming with laughter for minutes at a time. They laugh at quite precise points at the ends of sentences, and they laugh together. That doesn't look like an involuntary vocalization. That looks like something that's being coordinated. I think probably in reality, particularly if you're talking with somebody that you're really fond of and you're starting to laugh pretty hard, that the laughter can probably bounce back and forth between the two systems. You can find yourself with talking to a friend properly ending up crying with laughter. So it's not that it's just like a switch going one way or the other way. And laughter definitely primes laughter. Your own laughter can be very contagious to yourself. But that's the basis for me in the kind of the crudest distinction. Is it spontaneous laughter, or is it some level kind of communicative voluntary laughter? And then within that communicative voluntary laughter, it's very variable. So Greg Bryant's done stuff where he's collect excerpts of laughter from friends having conversations or people having conversations. So that's all voluntary laughter to some degree. But you can tell by listening to that how close the people are that are talking, because you do laugh differently the more you like someone, even if you're just having conversational laughter. So it's not like that's just one homogenous, unvarying block of communicative laughter. It can be extremely different. And it would include really, really warm laughter, like my brother's communicative laughter is terrifyingly realistic, or it might be something really sarcastic. You know, it's all kind of coming from that more voluntary system.
I read a little bit about how laughing behavior can be different across different individuals and related to traits of like empathy. So I was wondering, how is laughter related to personality traits in humans? Like, what is the main determinants of how much we laugh?
Well, we have just developed a questionnaire trying to pick out elements of people's personality, or, individual differences around laughter. And we found that there's four really big factors that sort of capture how people vary around these topics. So the first one is how much people think they laugh. How frequently do you think you laugh? People really vary in that. And then there's one about how much people like laughter, one about how much people understand other people's laughter, and the last one is how much people sort of have insight into their own use of laughter. Now, that first one, how much people think they laugh, it correlates with personality traits of extroversion and agreeableness. So agreeable extroverts think they laugh a lot. But we tried to validate this by doing a study where we got people to come in groups with their friends and looked at them talking. And we told them it was a study of friendship, but actually we were looking at how much they laughed. And what we find is how much people think they laugh does not predict how much they laugh in conversations. It does predict how much they laugh when they're on their own watching funny clips.
Oh,
In
so
contrast,
interesting.
how much people like laughter, that does predict how much people laugh in conversations.
Right.
So I think what this probably tells you most about is that people don't have a lot of insight actually into how much they laugh. If you ask people how often do you laugh, they seem to be thinking about laughing when they're on their own.
Yeah, I guess that's really unexpected.
Yeah.
And it seems like so social situations bring out a different side of you then, and it has more to do with who you want to be instead of who you are or who you think you are.
It's also plausible that people almost don't notice that they're laughing because it's such a basic aspect, such a kind of when you're in a particular mode. So there are previous studies showing that if you just ask people how much they laugh and then you compare that to how much they laugh, everybody underestimates how much they laugh. Everybody. So that's really all we did in this study was we showed that not only does everybody underestimate how much they laugh, but it doesn't even relate to how much they think they laugh. it's it's really interesting. So yeah, I think it's maybe that you're not that you're not being yourself, but that you when you're being yourself, you maybe just aren't noticing how much laughter you're actually doing. We've laughed a lot in this conversation, but
Yeah,
I couldn't give you a particular example of any one thing that made us laugh, you know?
yeah. Yeah, I'm also thinking about it right now.
Yeah.
Like, oh, what have I laughed at in this conversation?
Yeah.
And of course, also like what counts as laughter, because there's a lot of
Yeah.
little giggles you might do just to fill in
Yep.
silence or joining into other people laughing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I also wanted to ask on a slightly separate note if studying laughter, as you have done for most of your life, has helped you be a better comedian.
Oh God, I wish it did. So I've been studying laughter since sort of 2003, and I've only been doing stand-up comedy since 2010. And I only started doing that because UCL, my university, started comedy nights where all the performers were academics. It was called Bright Club, and sadly it doesn't really exist anymore, but it was good. It got a lot of people training. And the first time I did that, I was so anxious, I was just beside myself. And then actually, after I did it, I thought I want to do that again and get better at it. But the interesting thing for me was understanding laughter didn't make me a better comedian. I'm not a particularly good comedian, but having the experience of comedy taught me a lot more about how laughter works.
Right.
Because I'd never really thought about laugh in a theatrical setting before. And if I had, I think I assumed that the person was on stage and said something funny, and then the audience were like, "Yeah, we find that funny. Ha ha ha, we're laughing." And it's much more like a conversation. You've got this to and fro, and the audience response is really dynamic. And a lot of what you're doing when you're on stage is trying to control that and put jokes at the place that where it will maximally get a laugh. So it's the other way around. It's given me more interesting scientific questions. It's definitely not made me funnier.
That's a really good insight. I think we'll wrap up the episode there. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really interesting conversation about laughter.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for inviting me. Lovely to meet you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. It's been lovely to meet you.
And we hope you enjoyed listening to the episode. And if you did, find us on social media at neuroverse_pod and check out our website, neuroversepod.com, for more information about all of our episodes.